It's time now for the political analysis of Fromm and Fuller. Al Fromm, former political advisor to President Bill Clinton, and Craig Fuller, former political advisor to both President Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. Good morning, all. Al, I think I start with you this time, and I do want to talk very briefly about the primary results that came out of Tuesday. And then maybe we can move very quickly into a discussion about the tragedy that took place in Texas and some other related issues. But what was your takeaway from Tuesday?
My first takeaway is that former President Trump set up a test and failed. Very simply, this is a pretty crushing defeat for him in his own party, in the state that he is focused on more than any other, with his public enemy number one being Governor Brian Kemp, who he tried to defeat. And his candidate, who has won statewide elections, so it's not like he picked somebody who had no potential for doing well, but he had a candidate who ran on his big lie of that the election was stolen. And the result was 74-22. That is a pretty bad licking, as we'd say. But even more important is the candidate for Secretary of State in the Republican primary, Raffensperger, who defied Trump's efforts to make him or to steal the election, who Trump really wanted to get, put a congressman up against him, and everybody I'm sure Craig talked to and I talked to 2 months ago said Raffensperger was a dead duck. He came back and he won with a majority of vote, won by about 20 points, and avoided a runoff. So, for the last several weeks, Craig and I have been saying that Trump has a solid hold on about a third of the Republican electorate, which is a very small percentage of the national electorate, about 15% at most. But he has a hard time expanding it, even in his own party. So I'd say the biggest takeaway is that Trump suffered a big setback, no matter how he tries to play it.
Craig, what's your take?
Oh, well, I agree. I think Trump air is in a decline, and I don't see how you get this aircraft climbing again. I'll be honest with you. Not all of what Alice said is dead on. In addition to that, and what I think is also significant, is you now have former Vice President Pence, you have Chris Christie, you have other established Republicans no longer fearing standing up and being critical of Trump's candidates. And this is going to go the way of the neighborhood thug. They're successful in getting payments from people as long as they're feared. If they're no longer feared, they're no longer successful. I think Trump is no longer feared. And in addition to these Republican stalwarts, you also have the super PACs who are beginning to back candidates in opposition to Trump's candidate, conservative super PACs. That also says to me that they no longer think that Trump has the magic touch, and they're going to back candidates that they wish to see get elected regardless of what Trump does. Again, I don't see how he climbs out of this hole, which he frankly dug for himself for the reasons Al said. He set up a barrier and he couldn't get over it. And I just don't think, if he's no longer feared, he no longer has any kind of clout, and that's frankly just fine with me.
He's doing real damage to the Republicans because in a number of states, including Georgia, he has backed candidates like Herschel Walker, who for Republican seats that Republicans should win this fall, given the climate. But Walker has enough personal problems and enough liabilities that I think he's probably going to go down. And that could apply to J.D. Vance in Ohio, and if Mehmet Oz wins in Pennsylvania. So not only has his power diminished in the party, but it hasn't diminished enough to avoid his causing the Republican Party real problems this fall.
Al, I want to turn to what happened in Texas. And before we started taping, I was talking to Craig about how I wanted to somewhat connect the dots between what we're going through in this country and what just recently happened in Australia, where you had a true political mandate. In this case, it was global warming. But going back to what happened in Texas, we're dealing with a situation where for decades there has been consensus on common sense gun control, and yet there is no political capacity to do that. How do you create a mandate? It seems like the last time we had it was the Vietnam War, but maybe there are other examples where we can kind of be serious finally about this awful situation.
Well, first of all, let me say that I cut my teeth in politics in the Joe Tidings Maryland reelection, Senator Joe Tidings reelection campaign in 1970, where Tidings had proposed gun control and the National Gun Lobby came after him. His slogan was, he never ducks the tough ones, and the tough ones got him. So this is not a new problem. Really going back to 1968 when the gun lobby beat, I think it was Hugh Scott in Pennsylvania. And the gun lobby has had an extraordinary amount of power, probably more than more perceptually than real today. There's no question that going straight up at gun control, no matter what the merits are, and the merits seem to be pretty clear, is a losing battle right now in the Congress. One definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. Well, that's what happens every time. I mean, these shootings are horrific. It's, this is the only country in the world that has this problem of mass shootings. And that's really a tip of the iceberg of the gun violence problem. I mean, at my synagogue every Friday night, we read the names of the people who have been killed in gun violence in the District of Columbia, in the area every week, and it's always 5, 6, 7 names. So this, the mass shootings get national attention, but these killings, gun killings, are going on every day. I teach a class at Johns Hopkins, and I say, how do you get something through? I have 3 rules. One, it's got to make sense. Secondly, first impressions matter. And third, you have to create your own playing fields. And right now, all those things are going against the advocates of gun control. What happens is you have this terrible incident, people retreat to their own corners, and we get nothing done. Now, there is a model, actually, and it's the 1994 crime bill. Remember in 1994, we got the Brady bill and we got an assault weapon ban, but it was part of a comprehensive crime bill that also put 100,000 cops on the street and did a lot of had a lot of sentencing reform, some of which we probably have to change now, but it was an attack on the broader problem of crime, but it did include the most substantial gun control measures, certainly, in the last 50 years. I thought President Biden was, terrific on the night of the shooting, and when he came back from Asia, and he expresses the anger and hurt of the country, empathy of the country. But now what he ought to do is he's got to change the playing field. Eliminating assault weapons, or at least making you be 21 years old to get one, makes sense. So does, so do background checks. But if the first fight right in each battle is to, get clobbered, then you're making up ground and you just won't get done. So I'd change the playing field. What I would do if I were Biden right now, I'd call Mitch McConnell and I'd have a discussion about how we stop this stuff, and try to come out with a broader bill. Biden has some interesting proposals to support police. Maybe it'd be a police safety bill that he does. But, just trying to ram the traditional gun control bills down, they're right, I support them, they're never going to pass.
Yeah.
So he needs to try a new way.
Greg, do you feel like Mitch McConnell would take that call from Joe Biden at this point?
I hope he would. There's an old adage in politics that these elected officials, before they see the light, have to feel the heat. And I think the heat's getting turned up. Frankly, this tragedy, and it's one in a series, to me, it feels a little different. I mean, I can't imagine going to school as a young kid or being a parent and having children going to a school and fearing that on any day, someone could come into that school and firing these automatic weapons. And that has got to be going through the minds of young kids and of parents across the country today. We have flags at half-mast around the nation because we cannot get a handle on this. I don't know, I think your question's an interesting one. In some ways, it ties back to the first issue around Trump. And it has to do with the fact most elected officials in a position to do something, supporting more control over gun purchasing, have feared the NRA more than they've feared the gun control advocates. I think the NRA is probably in the weakest position it's been in decades currently. I might note they're meeting in Houston, Texas. They expect over 50,000 people. And who's going? Donald Trump, the governor of Texas, Senator Ted Cruz. They're going to go worship at the altar of the largest gun lobby in the world because they feel there are no consequences to that. And I think that has to change. One, you ask an interesting question, if they were to ask me, the gun control advocates, I'd say, you're betting on elected officials changing their mind because you think it's the right thing to do. It isn't going to happen until they have a real reason to do it. I'd start, I used to run associations. I'm not sure that I would go take a major, 2,000 or 3,000 person convention and put it in Texas today. They clearly, the gun laws increase the risk to people. And until some companies stop holding sales conferences and associations stop holding conventions in a state that has gun laws that are very permissive, I think we're going to be stuck with this. And those kinds of, you might call them sort of domestic sanctions, those kinds of actions by people have changed voters' minds and elected officials' minds in the past. But I think there has to be greater consequence for not standing up to this issue on a state-by-state basis. I honestly have been around firearms most of my life. I grew up next door to an FBI agent who taught me to shoot. I actually was an NRA member when they were more interested in education and selling their targets than in advocacy. And I fired automatic weapons with law enforcement instructors. And I can see no reason for people having those kind of weapons. First of all, if you're not highly trained, you're more likely to shoot people than you are or yourself than any other reason for having it. And I don't, I honestly, I think we've reached the point now where, I drive a car, but I can't do that without training and getting a license. I used to fly airplanes. I couldn't do that without training and being checked regularly. We live in a house which we can't live in unless it meets certain government requirements. Guns are just inherently dangerous. And there's no reason we should not require training, not require some registration and certification. And it really needs, but I think it's almost has to start by actions on a state by state basis, and to organize and build the kind of consensus around this issue that you saw in the Australia contest over the environment.
Al, I want to come back to you and try to get a take on how this may play out in the midterms. Do you think it might just simply evaporate over a couple of months, or do you feel like there is this opportunity to impact these close elections we're anticipating?
I think if the issue is narrowly fought on gun control, it's not going to have much impact this fall, because the people who are for it are, going to vote Democratic, and the people who are against it, a lot of them are going to be, most of them are going to vote Republican. I think if the issue is reframed as a widespread and broad effort, comprehensive effort to try to deal with violence in the country that goes beyond the mass shootings, that deals with the need to strengthen law enforcement as well. Perhaps it will help the Democrats a little bit by sort of lessening the impact, the negative impact the crime issue is likely to have on them this fall. But if it's just going to be fought out over guns or no guns, I mean, you'll have a lot of the good guys yelling and screaming, and what I'd consider the bad guys saying you're trying to take away my basic right, and we won't go very far. Here's a thought. What if President Biden went to the NRA convention and went straight in and said, look, we've seen what's happened in Texas, in Buffalo in the last 2 weeks, but we also know what's been happening in Washington, D.C., in Chicago, in Baltimore. I mean, you turn on the Baltimore news and there's a murder every night. And we've got to do something about this violence problem. And you need to be part of the solution as well as part of the problem. And so can't we, let's talk about steps we can do that would both strengthen law enforcement and reduce the chance of guns getting into the hands of criminals, because it doesn't do you any good when some crazy 18-year-old goes into a classroom and shoots kids. How does that help the NRA? How does that help honest gun owners? But take it to them directly. And sometimes, Craig understands this, because I remember when Dianne Feinstein was, I think, running for governor and went to the Democratic convention and got booed. Sometimes it helps to get booed because it frames the issue in a way that people will finally understand.
Craig, you have the last word.
I was going to say, it's a creative idea, but Joe Biden would have to show up with about 150 Secret Service agents around him, and that might be an interesting deterrent. I think that we talked last time about abortion and this sort of single issue voter that's out there, and they usually don't become a large enough number to sway an election. But I do think it's intriguing to consider what some candidates are going to be asked on two issues, very emotional, very long-standing kind of issues, where there are single issue candidates in both that are going to be pro-choice, and they're going to be anti-gun. And if a candidate answers the wrong way to both of those questions and goes 0 for 2, now there's a constituency that's more significant. So it'll be interesting to see whether, I don't know that the coalitions will formally join, but I think the candidate in a narrow race that is on the wrong side of both of these issues for independent voters, certainly, could see an erosion of support in that big middle area that we always talk about. And that could shape some of these close races in some interesting ways. I suspect that the fact that the two groups could in some ways, if joined together, have a greater impact will increase their efforts in the election, and it may make a difference.
We have to leave it there. Al Fromm, Craig Fuller, thank you so much indeed. We will see you next week.